My name is Charles Naud. I am the head of product for the sustainability tool, which is a reporting performance management software. Today, we have a 1-hour webinar that I'll be running on measuring and managing carbon. Just a quick introduction to our business. My parent company is called Action Sustainability. We are a sustainability consultancy recognized for our work in sustainability across the board. We have sustainability experts ranging from biodiversity all the way through to social value. We have a reputation in the market for our work on sustainable supply chain management. Notably, we wrote the British Standard on sustainable procurement, and we co-authored the ISO 2400 on sustainable procurement as well, which is recognized globally as the leading standard for responsible purchasing. We are also the only consultancy in the UK to have received the Queen's Award for our word, which we very proudly received last year. And our consultancy arm expands to an education and supply chain engagement platform through the Supply Chain Sustainability School, which I'll be talking about towards the end. And finally, I head up the sustainability tool, which is a suite of products and services around reporting, data collection, and performance management for sustainability. So if you're looking to quantify your impacts within your own operations or within your supply chain, then that is a service that we provide. So just a quick couple of sort of housekeeping rules, I guess. This is a webinar. We've got 1 hour today. We've got until 12 p.m. UK time. There is not an opportunity for you to speak, but you can ask questions using either the chat box or the Q&A. I think that's the best place. On Zoom, you've got a menu bar and you've got Q&A. You can click on that, ask questions, and I'll try and answer them as we go along if they're relevant to what I'm referring to, or otherwise I'll have some time at the end. I will provide the slides, my contact details as well. So if you've got any other questions afterwards, please do not hesitate to reach out, and I'll be more than happy to help you out. And just to reiterate there, I will be sharing the slides, the slide deck that I'm using, so you will have that. So the agenda for today is really, we're trying to understand, well, what is carbon measurement and how do we go about doing it? So we'll start off on why do organizations report on carbon. Then we'll go into the details of how to do this, for methodologies, for frameworks, some indications around calculations. And then we'll finish off in terms of practically, well, what can you do? What tools are available? What have other people done? So that you've got some clear actions on the back of this webinar. I must say this is for I guess people who are relatively new to carbon footprinting. I will be going through some of the basics. We do provide webinars that are catered to sort of those who are a bit more I guess aware of these problematics and of how to measure carbon emissions as well. So I encourage you to go and attend those webinars as well if you feel that's where you are. So let's get going. We've got a busy agenda this morning, so I'll jump straight into the content. So first of all, you're all here today. You're probably to some degree you're aware of that climate change. You're aware of the sort of impact that humanity is having on the planet, and you're probably aware of what's been going on in the news this summer, for example, or actually increasingly over the last few years, where we've got extreme weather events. But essentially, climate change, to summarize it, it's the biggest challenge that we're facing today as humanity. It's impacting absolutely everyone, with more severe weather events with increased temperatures and with all the knock-on effects that climate change has. And what we're seeing is that the time for action is reducing exponentially. So we've got less and less time to make a difference and to actually decelerate climate change. So we need to act now, and it's recognized that not only as individuals in society, but as businesses as well, there's a responsibility and a moral obligation to do something about it. Notwithstanding, of course, that there's policies and more sort of commercial pressures that are coming into play that are asking and enforcing your businesses to take action and to keep up with it. And that is being reflected really by sort of all surveys that we see in sustainability. When we ask businesses, what are their ESG priorities, we can see that more and more businesses year on year, we've gone in leaps and bounds in the last 10 years in terms of how ESG is being taken for organizations. Just to clarify, ESG is environmental and social governance. Essentially what I'm saying is that sustainability is being taken more seriously by businesses. And what always sits at the top of that agenda is carbon and the impact on climate change. So we're trying to, as businesses, overwhelmingly, that's the #1 priority. So I guess, what you need to ask yourselves in your organizations is, what are you doing about carbon? Are you measuring it? Are you trying to reduce? Do you have an action plan together? If not, why not? Because everyone else is doing so. So is a very good reason for you not to be addressing this, or are you falling behind? So that's just a question you need to ask yourselves and understand. Hopefully you're all already taking action, you're already on this pathway, and you're part of those businesses that already know the importance and just want to get going with actions now. You've probably seen this graph before, which shows essentially I guess the amount of greenhouse gases that we have in the atmosphere, and it's measured in parts per million. And what we're seeing there is a graphic that's showing over time how that's increased since the 1960s. And it just keeps on going up. And actually, if you look at trends from the Industrial Revolution, it's just going exponential. What's sad to see, of course, is that we've had major international accords on climate change. And unfortunately, when you track that against this graph that I'm showing then, the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, those accords are seemingly not making that much of a difference. So I guess as businesses, what we can ask ourselves is, well, if policies and regulation isn't having that much of an impact, or these accords not having that much of an impact, what can we do as businesses, and can we contribute? And that's sort of the ask. And we need to take action now, because the further we go, the harder it is the further we go up that curve there, the harder it is to sort of backtrack and take away emissions from the atmosphere. So we've got to take action now, much more sooner rather than later. Now, obviously, what I've shown there is sort of the emergency, and that businesses are taking sustainability and more importantly, carbon or climate change very seriously. But what we're seeing as well is we're starting to see sort of more regulatory pressures. We've seen in the last 10 years lots of new reporting requirements that have come into place, particularly around measuring carbon. In the UK, we've got reporting frameworks like the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting that some of you may fall under. There are non-mandatory reporting frameworks you might sort of commit to as well, such as Carbon Disclosure Project, the Science Based Targets Initiative. All of those things you probably have heard of, and you might be signed up to them, committed to them already, or you might be sort of forced to report against them. But essentially, what we're seeing is key trends is that more and more businesses are reporting on their carbon emissions. And what that means is that that is having a domino effect. Those requirements are being trickled through into the supply chains. So whoever you work for, or whether it's investors or your even government, who's your end client, seemingly what we're seeing is that those key stakeholders are asking for carbon emissions, asking for carbon reporting, and then that's being trickled through down into the supply chain. So ultimately, reporting on carbon used to be the stuff of larger businesses, larger corporates, but now it's even impacting, it's even becoming a requirement for SMEs, for small organizations, for micro enterprises to understand their carbon emissions and be able to report on that. We're seeing in tenders, for example, it's pretty much a standard question: do you report on your carbon emissions? What's your carbon reduction strategy, right? So it seems like it's something that we can't get away if we want to carry on being in business in the future. So what that means is that we need to measure our carbon emissions. And I just want to sort of define some terminology here, and actually that relates to a question that's been asked already. When I'm talking about carbon here, it's actually a bastardization of the word or of carbon. What we actually mean is we're talking about greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are those gases that, when in the atmosphere, they don't let the sun's heat for radiation. It hits the earth, hits the surface of the earth, enters the atmosphere, hits the surface of the earth, and then tries to escape. The radiation, the heat, tries to escape and come out of the atmosphere when it bounces off the Earth's surface. The greenhouse gases, they actually they trap that heat, they trap the radiation, and they keep it in the atmosphere. So that's sort of very simplified version of the science behind it. And so the more we have of those gases, the more the heat is trapped. And that's why we call them greenhouse gases, because it works a little bit like a greenhouse, but lets the heat from the sun in, but it doesn't let it out. And those greenhouse gases, we tend to sort of put them all under the term carbon. Why? Because carbon is the most widespread, it's the most sort of common greenhouse gas there is, but there are other greenhouse gases there. There's methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, PFCs, and sulfur fluorides. Those last three, they're actually groups of gases. So within that, they've got sort of more specific gases. I'm not going to list all of them, but essentially the key thing to remember is that when someone talks to you about carbon, reporting on carbon, 99% of the time, what they mean is they mean measuring your greenhouse gases. So they don't just mean carbon. They mean all the gases that cause the greenhouse effect, and that contribute to global warming. Now, so if I'm talking about carbon, I actually mean all of those. And technically speaking, I should always say carbon equivalents. And that's why sometimes you'll see written down CO2. CO2 is the chemical formula for carbon. You'll see a CO2 with a little E, and the E stands for equivalent. And it's actually saying we're measuring all the greenhouse gases, not just carbon. So hopefully that gives you an understanding that when I talk about carbon, it's all the greenhouse gases. When we talk about carbon as well, common terminology that you will hear is around scopes: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. That is essentially the way that we need to categorize emissions. We'll talk about the standards in just a moment's time, but essentially, much like accounting, when we measure carbon emissions, we have to follow a set of guiding principles and rules. And those guiding principles and rules say that we need to categorize our emissions by scope one. Scope one's all our direct emissions. So essentially, if I'm driving my car, I've got a combustion engine car that's fueled by diesel. I'm driving that car. I'm physically pressing the accelerator, and it's my car that's burning that diesel and emitting greenhouse gases. As a result, those are direct emissions. If I do make a fire in my garden, I'm physically generating carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions in my garden. I'm doing that, it's direct. If I've got a company and we've got a furnace, right? We burn gas, or we've got a factory and we've got a furnace there. We're physically burning that. That's all our direct emissions. Typically, that's activities that go on in your company vehicles, in your fleet, and in your company facilities. That's scope one. The next two scopes are indirect. Scope two is all your electricity, your steam, heating, and cooling for your own use. So if you, for 99% of businesses, it's just your electricity that you consume from the grid, right? It's such a large category that it's called scope two. You're not directly emitting carbon emissions, it's the utility provider that is. Okay, so those are your scope two emissions, it's your electricity consumption. For those of you that use district heating or district cooling, then that will be included in scope two as well. And that's essentially any energy that you get from the grid, whether it's electricity or heating and cooling. Scope three is the rest of your carbon emissions, and that's associated with everything that's not sort of directly emitted by your business. It's all the activities. So you use a courier who comes over. That courier's got a car or a moped or something. They're burning, that courier is generating greenhouse gases. It's not you, but it falls under your scope three because you're getting them to come to you, and so it's your scope three. It's their scope one, but your scope three. So there's overlap, right? Some people's scope one will be other people's scope three. But you can, if you look at scope three, it's very, very complex. There are actually sort of official categories within scope three. And there are 15 categories in total that we typically look at. And it goes from, the emissions in your investments to all the transport that you're using. I don't know if you use an accountant, well, all the emissions that they generate for providing services to you. It's just absolutely everything. On a personal level, if I buy a pair of shoes, I've not emitted any emissions by buying that pair of shoes. However, I have in that pair of shoes, there's carbon emissions associated with producing it, with packaging it up, with getting it over, transported from where it's been produced, maybe somewhere in China, let's say, all the way to the UK where I can buy it in a shop. So all of that falls under scope three. It is very, very vast. And sorry to say, it's actually quite complex to get your head around the scope three piece. Now, I've mentioned this, but essentially, I'm not making this up. This scope 1, 2, and 3. We don't make up how we measure carbon emissions. As I said, it's a bit like accounting. There are rule books. The key rule books are the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Protocol and the ISO 14064. Those two define how businesses should measure and report on their carbon emissions. We've read those. You don't need to. I would say leave it to the specialists, but we can support you in sort of very simple ways to carry out your carbon footprint. Just wanted to note as well that those are the two major rule books. But then we've got other rule books and sort of guidance documents specific to certain sectors. So here I've just pulled an image up of PAS 2080 in the UK, which provides guidance on how to measure and manage carbon in infrastructure. Got the same for construction, for lots of different, for services, for products, and so on and so forth. So there are lots of different sort of sub rule books and guidance documents that are out there that can be used. So I've been here sort of alluding to or referring to carbon measurement, but we must remember that a carbon measurement is just one piece in a full carbon reduction strategy. The entire strategy should look at, first of all, scoping, which I'll talk about, which is understanding, well, particularly on the scope 3, how far do I go, right? I was talking to you about a shoe that I've purchased. Am I responsible for the emissions of the packaging of that shoe? Or am I responsible for the emissions? So should I count that in my scope 3 or not? What about the machine that helped to produce the packaging for that shoe? Am I responsible for the emissions associated with running that machine, or even initially making that machine, right? So you could see it could go endless. So you need to sort of scope and define clear boundaries, and there are guiding principles, which I'll touch upon in a few moments' time. The next step is, once you've defined that, obviously get everything in place to measure, and today we'll talk more about measurement. Once you've measured, then you need to find ways of using that data and finding where you can reduce, where there are opportunities for efficiency, for reduction, for alternatives, et cetera, to try and reduce your emissions. You can then offset. So that means that you'll have remaining emissions. We say, I can't reduce currently, given my financial and then technical limitations, I can't reduce my carbon emissions further. I'm not at zero. So that remaining part, I will offset. And you can do that through offset programs. To really simplify, offsetting is essentially you're paying someone to remove emissions from the atmosphere. There's more nuances to that, but essentially, to simplify it for today's session, that's what it is. Offsetting does often have a bad press, but if it's done correctly, if it's part of a good carbon reduction strategy, and you're purchasing reliable, credible offsets, there's absolutely nothing wrong with offsetting. Very credible organizations use offsetting as part of their strategy as almost sort of a short to medium term solution until they're able to find ways of completely bringing their carbon emissions to zero. The final piece is around reporting. So then you need to report and say everything that you've done. You need to say, right, we define our carbon emissions, our scope as this, we measure them, these are emissions, we then set out with these activities to reduce, which means that now we've got less carbon emissions, but the remainder we decided to offset. So it's just to compensate for the time being. And this is what we'll do next year. And we're gonna measure it, and so on and so forth, and go back through that cycle. But you need to just report and communicate on that to let people know, your stakeholders, that you're doing that, and to be transparent about it. When it comes to actually measuring, the key thing, obviously there's a standard process of measuring, but you and your organization, there is nothing that's preventing you from setting up what we call sort of carbon KPIs, objectives, right? Key performance indicators and objectives. And you don't need to be a sustainability expert or a carbon measurement expert to do this. What you need to do is think pragmatically, think rationally about your business and say, right, how are we going to measure that we are achieving our carbon objectives? It might be very simply, our goal is to reduce impact on climate change, and our target is to be net zero by 2025. And therefore, our indicator is measuring our carbon emissions. The metrics are the data points that you need to collect on the back of it. That's where you might need support from a specialist, or using tools that help you to know what data points will help you measure your carbon emissions. But you could also look at other KPIs, such as, we will make sure that one of our KPIs is that we are encouraging our supply chain to reduce their carbon emissions. And the first KPI on that will be measuring the percentage of suppliers who measure their carbon emissions, right? So you could see that you could set different KPIs based on who you are, and it's not all just about measuring your carbon emissions. Obviously, that's key component of that, but you can have other KPIs that help you as a business sort of move strategically along this agenda. When it comes to the actual calculation, the key methodology is to, and the objective is to try and understand your activity data, such as we consume 250 liters of diesel, for example, and then you times that by an emissions factor. An emission factor is backed by science, right? And it's backed by research, where there have been studies that say, in the UK, on average, every liter of diesel generates 2.75 kilograms of carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. So you times your liters times by the emissions factor, and you get your total carbon emissions for, in this example, your liters of diesel consumed. The emissions factor in the UK, we're really, really lucky that the government releases a set of official emissions factor every single year. They're quite extensive. They are limited in some areas, but they are the ones that you should use. If you feel that there are I guess, things that you need to include in your carbon footprint that are not available in the government's conversion factors, you've got other reputable databases that you can go to, such as Bath, the University of Bath publish conversion factors for materials, for example, for building materials and so on. So you can go to other areas. If you're measuring carbon abroad, you need to look, does that country publish emissions factors? And if not, what's the next best thing that I can use? So it's really sort of on a case-by-case and country or region-by-region basis. And if you don't have anything available, think, what's the next best thing that I can use? To give you examples, these are emissions factors from the UK. So you can just sort of start comparing things, So down on the left-hand side, just comparing two sort of energy sources, so grid electricity and red diesel. Grid electricity, 1 kilowatt hour generates 0.288 kilograms, while red diesel generates 0.316 kilograms, so slightly higher. So if available, it's better to be using electricity than red diesel, right? For travel, for example, there we can see 500 kilometers, passenger kilometers, right, by train, car, and airplane. And clearly we could see that train is the most efficient from a carbon perspective. It's 18 kilograms for 500 passenger kilometers, while it's 84 by car and 122 by plane. So the same distance for one passenger, that's what it equates to. Those are the averages. You might say, but it depends how full the train is, etc. This is averages, and it's averages that the UK government publishes. Just look at materials here as well, and I've ordered these in order of the increase in terms of their carbon impact. But that's 1 ton of aggregate on the bottom left, all the way to 1 ton of steel. 1 ton of aggregates is 5 kilograms. 1 ton of steel is 1,550 kilograms. If you've got the option between using steel or aggregate for a project that you're doing, it might be a construction project, whatever it is, from a carbon perspective, it's going to be more efficient to use aggregates. You're going to be emitting way less carbon. So there you go, and you can see sort of things in between. Now, of course, there are other factors in play. You might have to use steel, right? So now the key thing is obviously these are average but for each materials. Now, when you buy steel, not every single piece of steel is the same, right? So you can also, if you're purchasing steel, let's say, you can understand from your suppliers, have you actually carried out a carbon assessment for your specific steel? And they might say, yes, it's really it's sustainable steel because we use, less energy in the manufacturing process, et cetera, et cetera. And for us, we generate 900 kilograms for 1 ton, as opposed to 1,550 kilograms for 1 ton, right? So you can still do that. And I'm not, these are averages to help you measure quite simply. But if you're purchasing steel, for example, feel free to speak to your provider and ask them, have they got anything that's more specific for their specific steel? Have they carried out a study for their specific steel? And it might be the case that they have done so, and therefore you can use that conversion factor that they provide. Now, what I've presented there is sort of the core basic mechanisms for measuring carbon emissions, really at a really specific level. I used, some materials examples, some travel examples, example of using fuels. Now, one thing you might come to realize is, well, we don't have any of this data. I can't tell you how much petrol our company used this year. So thankfully, what you can do is when you look at carbon conversion factor databases like the UK government's one, they sometimes provide alternatives. So, for example, for travel, you can either report by fuel, which is the best thing, or you could report by mileage of vehicle travel. So I don't know how much petrol we consume, but I know that in our company, we traveled, 2,000 miles this year in small cars, right? And the UK government will give you conversion factors for small cars and one mile traveled in them. So you times it by the mileage and so on and so forth. The problem is that sometimes you don't have the data whatsoever. So there's a hierarchy of the data. The best thing is to actually have the real data, right? And you should be working towards having the real data for all of these things that you need to include in your carbon footprint. If you don't, then you can use proxy data. So that's where you use things. Typically, what is used is price, is spend, and that relates to a question that's been asked. So what you can do is you can say, well, I don't know how much petrol I used, but I know that I spent, and I don't know how many miles I traveled, but I know that I spent, I don't know, £3,000 on petrol this year. And on average, this is the cost of petrol. And therefore, I can estimate the amount of petrol that I consumed, right? So you're using proxy data. You're using another data set as an intermediary to get you to the numbers that you want. So there are organizations that sell analysis that tell you well, on average, if you spent £500,000 on this material this year, on steel this year, on average, that's probably about 20 tons of steel. Sorry, I've got no idea of the price of steel, so I'm probably way off there, but that's 20 tons of that's probably 20 tons of steel, and so you use that. If you don't have any proxy data, so I don't even know how much I spent on steel or how much I spent on petrol, what you can then do is use sample data, right? And you could say, right, let me just look at one project, or let me just look at, let me track my vehicles for 1 week, or one vehicle for 1 week. And then I know I've got 20 vehicles and they're 52 weeks in the year, and therefore I times all of this by that. And that gives me an approximation of what my real data would be. All right, so that's just using sample data. Typically, it's better to use proxy data than sample data. You'll get more accuracy on proxy data than sample data. It's not always the case. Again, think rationally about it within your organization, within the context of what data you're trying to gather. The key thing is to write down your methodology, and in your communication, in your reporting, to make sure that that's clearly articulated, that you've said, this is how we got to these numbers. So that's key to do that. I'm just going to go back here to the terminology slide, and just to remind you of that scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 that I was talking about. And essentially, if you look at this slide, and I'll be sharing these slides afterwards, if you look at these, you can see that there's sort of things that are written there, you know, company facilities, company vehicles, electricity, and so on and so forth. Essentially, if you can gather as much data pertaining to those high-level categories as you can, and then find the conversion factors either from the UK government website or from, you know, you purchase other proxies that are available from reputable sources. You times those proxies by the data that you've got. You're in a really, I mean, you're there. You're measuring your carbon emissions, right? You just need to then say that's my scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and you're doing it, right? I'm not going to go into this slide, but this is just a slide of just starting to give you ideas of where does data come from for scope 1. You know, where do you get that information typically, and what data typically goes in there. So it's not extensive, but it's just giving you an idea of that. But hopefully, if you start looking at this slide and reading it in details, it will tell you electricity, that typically comes from, you know, your grid, you know, your electricity bill, and that's what you need to get, and so on and so forth. If you then map that to the previous slide that I was showing, and start doing the same exercise for all those categories that fall under the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 of the previous slide, you're measuring your carbon emissions. You're there. One thing though to flag up is scope 3, and scope 3, as we have already covered, it seems pretty vast and pretty complex. And just to give you a sign of or an indication of how complex it can be, often it means actually getting carbon data from your supply chain. And as I mentioned, your supply chain's data goes into your scope 3. So their scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 goes into your scope 3. Not all of it, but a proportion of it, right? That's relevant to the work that they carried out for you. In turn, they've got a supply chain, you know, and they've got a supply chain, and so on and so forth. So you could see that you could get into an exercise trying to go down all the tiers of your supply chain, which is quite complex, but we can simplify it. And it's actually important. It's important to tackle this because, on average, there's 80% of your carbon emissions are in your supply chain, right? So the biggest bulk of your carbon emissions will be in your supply chain. No matter what industry you're in, this pretty much holds, you know, I'm confident it holds 95% of the time, if not more. And also, as I mentioned earlier on, there are more and more reporting frameworks and regulations that are asking organizations to measure carbon in their supply chain or to include scope 3 in their reporting. Before, people just used to focus on scope 1 and scope 2. Now there's an emphasis on making sure that they're focusing on scope 3. Just a note on that, because it came up as a question earlier on. First of all, there are no known, to my knowledge, there are no sort of regulatory requirements for SMEs, for small organizations, to report on carbon emissions from a regulatory perspective. There might be one or two sort of exceptions in really specific industries that I'm not aware of, but I don't think there are any small organizations that have to report on their carbon emissions in the UK. Oh, sorry. But however, um, um, if your clients are forced to report and they're forced to report their supply chain carbon, then it might mean that as a result, you have to report to your client to work for them. So that's where sort of that requirement comes in. The other thing is that someone asked, well, I'll just go back to the previous slide, but this refers to supply chain reporting. If I'm reporting if I'm using some of my supply chain's emissions in my reporting, is there not double counting? Yes, there is double counting, right? There is double counting, but that's by design. That's how carbon accounting and methodologies work. But it's not a problem, right? It's just to know that if your supplier says that they've got a carbon footprint of 100 tons, and 20 of those tons might also be included in your carbon footprint that you do. That's absolutely fine. It's not double counting as such. It's just I'm reporting something, I'm reporting my impact, you're reporting your impact here. We're not going to aggregate the two and go, well, together we generated X tons, just adding the two simply. You would look, that's when you would look for the overlap, right? But yeah. So that hopefully answers that question around that. Just going to go into the boundary piece. And when we talk about carbon and the scope 3 element, that understanding the emissions in my supply chain, as I said, we need to scope out, we need to sort of provide boundaries and say, well, where am I going to stop? The greenhouse gas reporting protocol, the ISO standard on carbon reporting, stipulate that you've got essentially 3 different approaches that you can use. There's the equity approach. So essentially, that's saying I'm going to measure the carbon emissions, 100% of the carbon emissions, for anything that I have equity in. Another piece, another approach is to say I'm going to count anything I have financial control over. So I don't have equity in the courier that I used, but I've got financial control over them coming or not, right? Because I pay for them to come and deliver something. So that's financial control. The other thing is operational control. So I've got control over whether, let's say I'm a hotel, or we're a co-working space, right? I've got control over what type of lighting goes into my buildings. Therefore, I'm going to be responsible for the emissions associated with the lighting, right? So that is operational control. So you've got to define and look at what makes sense for your business. Just gonna finish off the methodology part on scope 3 again, and to say that with scope 3, you might have heard of different approaches. A lot of organizations look at their spend and say, well, I spent £1 million on catering, and we use one of those proxies that say, on average, for every £1 million spent on catering in the UK, there's, I don't know, 500 kilograms of carbon emissions. So we multiply, £2 million by 500 kilograms of carbon emissions, and that's what we get. That is great because everyone's got access to their spend data. You've all got, I'm sure, really good accounting procedures in place, and you can tell, to the penny how much you spent on catering last year, or how much you spent on couriers, or how much you spent on paper supplies, and so on and so forth. The problem is that for next year to show a reduction, the only thing you can do is spend less, right? So if you're a growing business and actually you suddenly start using better paper supplier, more carbon efficient, or you might spend more, but you might be more carbon efficient. And so that's why you want to look at alternative methodologies. There's one approach which is looking at activity-based approach. So that's getting the underlying data that we wanted. So get your suppliers to tell you, get your courier to tell you how many miles did they drive, or how much petrol did they consume for your deliveries. or get your paper supplier to say how much paper they delivered to you and how much carbon was associated with that, just for your paper that they produced, which is great. That gives us a lot of accuracy, and it's really great in some circumstances, but in other circumstances, that's a step too far and it's too detailed. And therefore, what you have is a hybrid solution called the apportionment solution, where you get your supply chain to measure their overall carbon footprint, all right? Get your supplier to measure their overall carbon footprint, and then to apportion to you based on how much turnover you represent for them. So let's say your courier measures their carbon footprint and they emitted 100 tons of carbon last year for all their work, and you represented 20% of their turnover, then they're going to attribute 20 tons to you. So that's the apportionment methodology, which provides a lot of simplification. As an organization, we provide a free carbon calculator for SMEs. So I invite anyone to go and use that. It's available on carbon.sustainabilitytool.com. And that calculator is used as a dual purpose. It actually enables you to do that apportionment piece that I talked about. And as a result, it enables organizations who've got a supply chain and who want to measure the carbon in their supply chain to receive apportioned carbon emissions from their supply chain. It's a really, really simple methodology. It's a really, really simple tool, and it helps you to get on your carbon reduction journey, whether you're looking to do that through your supply chain, or whether you're just an organization looking to do that for your own business. And so it works for both. This is what the carbon calculator looks like. It provides really nice dashboards, and you can use this for free. You can go in for free and look at that. It breaks down your data by activity. So understanding, do my emissions, are they a hotspot in transport or in materials or fossil fuels, etc., by scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and then you get a total carbon figure as well, and some analysis around that. That's used by currently over 700 supply chain organizations for these clients that are listed here. But these are mainly sort of built environment sector organizations, but actually the calculator works for anyone outside of that as well. So if you're interested, I do invite you to go and use that system, and it's completely free to use for you. And if you want to use it for your supply chain, then do be in touch, and I can help there. Just also want to flag up that as an organization, through our work with the Supply Chain Sustainability School, our education and supply chain engagement platform, we have over 300 carbon resources that are freely available as well. We hand out a lot of our knowledge for free because we want people to upskill and have the tools and resources to be able to improve their impact. Got 300 resources specifically on carbon. Those range from 2-minute videos that give you small explainer videos on specific topics, all the way through to workshops and webinars like this one that you can sign up to, as well as e-learning that you can do. Probably they range between 45 minutes and 1 hour e-learning that you can do in your own time, with reading, with exercises, interactive exercises in the e-learning. You can access all of that for free. You can use that, share it with your colleagues so that they get an understanding of around carbon, lots of different things, from measuring to reducing, to communicating, to understanding the basics, and so on and so forth. I'd also like to just flag up that as an organization, we also provide resources and tools. Those are not free. Those are systems that we commercialize, but we help organizations to measure their carbon footprint for their own businesses, for their supply chain, for their client projects, and so on and so forth. We've got, so if you're looking for something that's more detailed, that's more complex, that breaks down by site, by business unit, by client projects, The carbon calculator doesn't do that, but our tool, our sustainability tool does that. And we've got solutions and we can handhold you through that entire process to measure emissions accurately throughout your business and your supply chain and to be able to report that to your key stakeholders. I've mentioned our reputation at the beginning. As you know, we've won awards. We are recognized globally for our work in sustainability, and we work with some of the major organizations in the UK, both sort of public sector and private sector. We work with really large organizations, major projects, engineering and complex construction projects as well, all the way through to small SMEs, service-based SMEs. So a real variety of clients and industries. If you're interested, you can book a call with me to discuss more around our reporting solutions and how we can help you with your carbon reduction and carbon footprinting. So my colleague will just share a link to that, and you'll receive the slides with links and my contact details as well afterwards. So there we go. That's what we've got time for today. What I will do now is I will come back to some of the questions that were asked that I didn't respond to. So apologies for those people. I will go through that now. So there was a question around whether there will be a replay. This session is recorded, so we will make this available and we will share the recording as well as the slides. So if you were late, you can access this. We do other sessions that you can sign up to, so watch out for those. We can run this session again if you found it interesting, right, for your colleagues and so on. So do let us know, and we can do that. There's a question here that I'm just going to read, which is relating to scope 3. And someone saying that if they have a product like clothing that has high footprint, so it's someone asking, well, what about emissions from our users, right? So let's imagine an organization that sells clothing. There's obviously emissions associated with the users who purchase, your jumper or whatever, and then they go and wash that jumper. And you might communicate and try and reduce the amount of consumption, the amount of carbon emissions associated with your consumers using your jumper, right? Washing it less, and therefore less electricity, and therefore less carbon. So of course what you can do, and that comes into your scope 3. So scope 3 emissions, I know I focused a lot about supply chain, I apologize, but it's also about, so it's about upstream and downstream activities. The downstream activities will be things like, what do consumers do with your product? What about when it's a waste product, right? And all the energy and the emissions associated with managing that waste. So there, of course, what you can do is it's probably going to be really difficult for you to know how many times every single one of your customers washes the jumper and the electricity associated with that, and therefore the emissions. So there, you're probably looking at using proxy data or sampled data. So make sure you have a robust methodology and you say what your assumptions were. Then you can go, so you can from that estimate the carbon emissions associated with all the jumpers that you sell and the washing of them by your consumers. And you could say, well, that's in our scope 3, but we're going to try and reduce that. And so we do a comms campaign, for example, and then you might survey some of your consumers. So that's using sample data, and they might say, well, yeah, now I only wash it once every 2 months instead of once every month, and therefore you could legitimately say it seems like we've cut washing by 50%, and therefore the carbon emissions associated with washing the jumpers by 50%. So that's how you can do that. Obviously, there's a strategy around it, but as you can see, it's just sort of thinking rationally. How am I going to legitimately be able to demonstrate the impact that my comms plan has had on encouraging consumers to wash their jumper less, as an example? There's a question around whether the calculator that I showed is regulated or audited in any way. It is aligned to the greenhouse gas reporting protocol. And so it's aligned to best practice and to how carbon reporting should be done. It has also been vetted by over 60 sustainability experts who work with us to develop this system. So we've had lots of organizations look through it, go through it with a fine comb and say, yeah, this is correct. Also, as an organization, we are, experienced and trained up sustainability experts and carbon reporting experts. So we attest to that as well. There's a question of saying, well, should a car manufacturer count all the fuel that's used in their cars? That goes back to the boundaries, right? They might say, well, we don't have operational control or financial control. So when, it's not reasonable to say that we're going to be associated, we should factor in the carbon emissions of how much petrol are drivers, people who buy our cars, how much petrol they put in the cars. You could argue, well, no, you've got a responsibility for that, because if you would be out of the business if your consumers weren't able to do that, because they wouldn't be able to buy your cars, because they wouldn't be able to use your cars. So whether it's right or wrong, that's not for me to decide, right? And that's for the business or consumers to put pressure and to say, as a manufacturer of cars, we think that you should, in your carbon footprint, include the carbon emissions of the fuel that's burnt from people driving the cars that you've sold to them. That doesn't mean that it takes the responsibility away from the consumer as well, right? Remember that double counting that I talked about? It goes into the company's carbon footprint, but it also goes in that consumer's carbon footprint, right? So there's overlap. They're both counting the same thing, but they both should report on that, arguably. So there's no right or wrong answer on that, but a car manufacturer could legitimately say, in our carbon footprint, we're going to include, as part of the scope 3, the emissions associated with the fuel that people who are driving our cars use. Just going to try and hurry through 2 final questions, and then I would have done all of them and coming up this time. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Just someone who's saying that they have a hybrid work arrangement, and some people work from home and from the office. So obviously the office working will generate electricity, will consume electricity on site that you pay for as a business, that goes into your scope 2. For the home working, that goes in your scope 3. You're not paying, as a business, you're not paying for the electricity. It's your employees are paying for their own electricity. However, you might factor in a certain amount of emissions from them working from home and using their own electricity, and that would go into your scope 3. The UK government, in their emission factors, they provide specific emissions factors for working from home and hours worked from home by employees, so you can use that. It's available online. I'll provide a link to those emission factors as well in the follow-up. And the last question was around the definition of net zero, and asking whether it just covers scope 1 and scope 2 or not. So there are various definitions of net zero. Yes, to be net zero, typically people will refer to just to their scope 1 and scope 2. Scope 3, however, as we've seen, as I've been saying, is increasingly included in reporting frameworks and increasingly required for organizations to report and demonstrate what they're doing about their scope 3. Not just a marketing exercise, it's becoming a key business requirement, just like it is to report on your scope 1 and scope 2. As a result, it's really key that you engage with your supply chain and understand your upstream and downstream emissions when you're reporting and establishing a carbon reduction strategy. So there we go. I've come to the end of the questions. We're just 2 minutes over, so many apologies for running over, but thank you very much for all those really interesting questions. Thank you very much for everyone for attending. You've got my contact details there. We'll share the slides and a just quick follow-up email with a few of the links that I referred to. Please feel free to reach out to me if you've got any further questions or want to have a chat. My door's open. So there we go. Thank you very much and have an excellent rest of the day.